Good morning and welcome to Mexilex. So as we're entering into the final stretch of the campaign, the specter of a trade war is rearing its head, tariffs, the renegotiations of Nafta, and questions of how will the Mexican economy change if a López Obrador nominally progressive government gets into power. So to discuss all of these questions, we have the pleasure to be today with Alejandro Álvarez Béjar, who is a professor of economics at the UNAM with a specialization in the Mexican economy and the North American region. So precisely what we want to know about. Alejandro, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And let's see if I can add something interesting for the Canadian audience.
Okay, Colin, take it away.
Okay, Alejandro, let's start with what Kurt mentioned, at least the discourse, the rhetoric lately has been pretty hostile between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico vis-a-vis the Nafta negotiations. Tariffs have been imposed on Mexican products, on Canadian products, and now retaliatory tariffs being imposed by both those countries on the United States. So give us your sense of where you think the Nafta negotiations are going, if anywhere at all. Give us your sense of where all this might be leading.
Well, I think that we really are facing a delicate time in the sense that trade war is going on already. And that began with the U.S. Against China, and later on he opened the door for imposing tariffs also to Canada and Mexico, mainly on steel and aluminum. This is the beginning of the story. Nafta negotiation were some kind of a part of this issue because it has been under negotiation for several months between the government of Canada, the Mexican government, and the U.S. government. And it seemed like even though they were talking that the negotiation was almost over, in reality they always left something open. Mm-hmm. And when you look at that, you can see that there is a group of difficulties in the negotiation, particularly in the automobile trade area. But not only that, there is also some other areas where there is no agreement, and the Trump administration was looking for a better position for the U.S. Producers, and I would say producers, even though he insists that he's looking for the workers' interests.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of the opponents of Trump have said, both in Mexico and the United States, have said, well, tariffs are bad, it's terrible, you know, it's going to lead to inflation and raise the cost of things. But also, free trade has been devastating for Mexico as well, since, you know, it's led to the abandonment of agriculture, and it's turned Mexico into a kind of a maquiladora economy. So how can we make a progressive critique of what's going on without falling into the default position of free trade, which is not a progressive way of running an economy? Certainly not between disequal economies.
Yes. I think that the last thing that you say, the mention, it's the most important thing. NAFTA, it's an agreement that was signed between two developed economies and one underdeveloped economy. Okay. Mm-hmm. And there were no design for shortening asymmetries. Right. So in reality, the free trade agreement was designed to have the best of the worlds for big capital. Right. It's just low wages, no tariffs, and free flow of investment without free movement of people. That's the main purpose of the NAFTA deal. And I think that during the NAFTA 1, I would say the NAFTA 1,
Right.
the one that began in 1994 and has come to recently when we have heard about the NAFTA 2 agreement. During the NAFTA 1, the main damages of lowering the tariffs or destroying the tariffs in trade between Canada, US, and Mexico, I think most of the damage came to the Mexican economy. Because we were in the worst productive position, in the weakest condition for investment and for technology and for growth. So in this way, just lowering the tariffs were one way of destroying, particularly the small and medium enterprises. Right. All over the country, but not only in Mexico, because it also happened in Canada and in the US.
Right. Okay, that's great background on NAFTA. I mean, one of the interesting things about this election in Mexico coming up at the 1st of July is that all three of the major coalitions are basically have said they will support NAFTA, the NAFTA negotiations. Given that one of those parties, Morena and López Obrador, are ostensibly the progressive alternative, how are they going to square that circle? How are they going to be in favor of NAFTA and yet do the things that they've said they were going to do in terms of progressive social policies for Mexico, righting the damage that NAFTA has already done, or NAFTA 1 has already done?
Well, I think there is no clear project about these issues, neither in Morena program nor in López Obrador declarations. This is one area where you only have general definitions without specific developments. What I think is that there is one issue that it's very sensitive for the Mexican population, which it is related to wages. Right. The Canadian government is saying, well, the Mexican needs to raise wages. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. government says, well, the Mexican need to raise wages. But the Mexican government says, no, we can't. Because that's the main...
That's our competitive advantage.
Yes, that's the competitive advantage.
How sad.
I think that's the most important issue. Yeah. There is also one key problem, which it is employment. Mm-hmm. When you look at the discourse, official discourse of the Mexican presidency, he argues that he is the employment president because he has created several million jobs. Right. And this is one thing that needs to be explained, because it is true that we have seen the increase of jobs, but the secret of this that there is a movement of destruction of well-paid jobs and the creation of bad-paid jobs.
Yes.
This is what it is frequently referred in the economic literature as precarization.
Yes.
It's precarious job, what we have seen. Yeah. And this is true also in Mexico. Yeah. So that's why they don't want to increase the wages. Yes. Because they have made a base for the economy with jobs that are bad paid. Yeah. And if you change that condition, then the competitive advantage for Mexican economy will be disappear in a very short time.
Yes.
And there is also one critical issue that it is referred to the problem of productivity. The Mexican businessmen say that in order to increase the wages, we need to increase first productivity. But we have had increases in productivity with no wage increases.
Todo el mundo.
Yes, that's all over the world.
A follow-up question on this. Conventional wisdom would seem to dictate that the Trump administration would want to wrap up negotiations before a progressive government were elected to lock in NAFTA 2 for an AMLO government. But as we were talking about before we began the interview, Trump hasn't gotten everything he wants, so the negotiations apparently will remain open, which will give potentially AMLO a seat at the table to negotiate some changes. What will AMLO negotiate that's different than what Peña Nieto and the PRI have been trying to get?
Well, when you look at the Morena program, the López Obrador declarations, and also the speeches of his advisors, the only thing that remains is that López Obrador wants to develop the petrochemical industry, right, and to reorganize a little bit the whole. We now have 6 refineries, and he's talking about the creation of another 2 with specificities. And there is also an announcement that all the contract that was signed under the Peña Nieto administration will be revised. Mm-hmm. This is because we had a background of some corruption in energy deals, particularly with Brazilian enterprise.
Right, Odebrecht.
So, Odebrecht. But if you think carefully about that, I think that most of the contracts will probably be okay, I mean, in my view. So the thing is, if you are going to reverse the energy reform or not.
Right.
And I think that in order to change that, López Obrador hasn't been very clear. He insists that the energy reform has damaged the national interest, but nobody is talking except of the population, right, who says that the national feeling is that we have lost the domain of natural resources, and particularly delicate with the petroleum industry, and we need to recover that. But there is no clear program on that.
Okay. He also has talked about agricultural self-sufficiency. How would that work within the context of the NAFTA renegotiations, well, considering how much Mexico now imports?
Yeah, well, we have a very peculiar condition, because this is true that we have increased agricultural production, but this is also true that we are importing a lot of agricultural products, particularly from the U.S. And NAFTA trade in agriculture, I don't know the figure, but could be around $40 billion, which is a lot. And this is to say that the interests on that area are very powerful, and the damages for the Mexican producers have been severe. So any program to recover some kind of sovereignty or the recovery of local producers will be with immediate effects, positive effects in the economy. And there is a lot of people worry about this issue, because at the same time we are having an offensive of energy big oil companies trying to enter into the territory to make the exploitation of resources having priority in their investment, while most of this production will imply destruction of land and Indian properties, yep, all over the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the environment, presumably.
And will be a disaster for the environment. Let's see if next July 1st, really we can begin to see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes. I do have one final question, if we can get this in here. How can we envision a Mexican public policy that's not neoliberal? How would that look?
Well, I think that it is very easy to understand a thing like that. Let's talk about education. We have seen labor reform with the name of educational reform that in reality is trying to destroy the gains of the teachers and the unions without really attending the main necessities of education. Mexico, as well as Canada, with the provincial differences, Mexico is a highly differentiated or regionalized country. And if you want to try to apply a homogenic policy for the whole country, this is going to be a disaster immediately. We need to address the problems in a local and regional basis, because in some of these places we concentrate Indian population. This is not much for the country, that when we have more than 125 million people, but if you consider that we have probably 12 or 13 million people from Indian origin, that really means a lot.
Yeah, and therefore education being provided in their own languages, idioms, and so forth. What about on the issue of taxation? There's been very little. Even López Obrador has said, "I'm not going to raise taxes on the wealthy."
This is one thing that it really worries me, and that's why, in a way, I could agree with the guys who are saying that we have an election with three conservative coalitions competing, because nobody talks about a fiscal policy.
No.
Just forget it about raising taxes. López Obrador, it's bringing the same austerity policy that all neoliberals have been implemented in Mexico, but with the difference. He's talking about reducing the highest salaries of the administration, the top officials, administrators, and with that money make a saving in order to increase the budget and to develop all the programs. I think that this is not very convincing. Mm-hmm. It is not enough.
Yeah.
And what we really need is a fiscal reform.
Right. And this brings us back to squaring circles. I mean, as we've been traveling around the country, talking to people, it's so obvious that people want change, but they want radical change. Many of those who are bound to support López Obrador, to vote for Morena on July 1st, many of their demands are much more radical than those from, the sort of party officials and from López Obrador himself. I mean, what do you think are the prospects for really pushing forward a much more radical agenda, despite the conservatism to some degree of the leadership of Morena?
Well, I think that we need to address this issue in a dynamic way. Mm-hmm. If you think only in local terms, probably the things have no chance for changing immediately. But let's have a look to the international economy and see what's going to happen if we have another financial crisis, when we haven't solved the crisis of 2008-9. And if you have a new stage with these problems for the world economy, I think that the dynamic can be very rapidly changing. Yeah. And in that case, I think that even this is interesting to mention, because recently appeared in El País one interview with José Ramón Cosío, which is a member of the Supreme Court, and he says that what we really need is a fiscal reform for the rich paying more taxes. And this is not a radical; it's a quite conservative guy, and so I agree with the diagnostic. No, what we need is just we only capture as taxes no more than 17% of GDP, which it is much more less than the OECD countries, or countries with development the same stage as Mexico, like Brazil or Chile or Argentina. Yeah. So that means that we really, this has been, and this explains also why Mexico has impoverished, while at the same time having a select group of people between the billionaires of the world.
Right.
So we need to address this issue, and I think that it doesn't matter if you don't put the issue right now, but you need to be ready to think about it for the coming future, because that can change very rapidly.
Alejandro, thank you very much on behalf of Mexilex. It was a really wonderful conversation.